I'd love to welcome you back to our afternoon block for the sixth annual Faith and Entrepreneurship Research Conference. This session is going to start with a panel on entrepreneurship with contextualized faith-based identities and logics. We have excellent panelists, among them Aslan Gümüsay from LMU Munich, Laurenz Weisse from the University of Augsburg, Gunjan Saxena from the Paris School of Business, and David Townsend from Virginia Tech. Ali, if I can ask you first, what does your faith in entrepreneurship research tell us about committed actors in secular institutions?
Thank you, Corey. And let me first of all start to say that I'm very grateful to be back here to this community, this family. It's always a pleasure. I'm wearing a jacket because I'm actually outside at a train station. The train was delayed, which might be an image for where we are heading, right? Onwards and upwards, this community. It's also maybe it's on the way. But I guess I stopped there with any kind of analogies because it's also cold. But maybe our community is growing warmer by the minute or something like that. But to your question, right? I mean, context really matters. Religion is context and also core text. It's actually both textual and also practical. I guess that's a different discussion. And what I'd like to do is really share with you a couple of articles, but also thoughts on your question. And as my previous speakers did during the day so far, giving kind of some food for thought, right? While I enjoy the sunset here at 7 p.m. in Germany, so I might get distracted by that as well. So in context, this might be a piece that matters. So context is important. Religion matters, and religion is partially context, but partially also action, right? And actor. And we know from the Pew research that religion is extensively important. We know from Paul Tillich that religion is an ultimate concern. So it has effectively extensity and intensity, right? Religion is personal, not private, so it matters. And for me, that means that the secular is religious. Like the secular in itself is actually religious. And the articles or the points I like to make here are kind of all referencing these articles. So as I said, I'll share them in the chat as I go along. So let me walk you through the kind of three levels, right? The individual, the meso, and then the macro level, and then go a bit into politics in the next 8 minutes or so. So on the individual level, I would say that religion forms and transforms entrepreneurs, leaders, and so on, right? So it's not just that they are informing the way entrepreneurs do their work, but actually it transforms the very essence of entrepreneurship and leadership and so on. And I've talked about this in articles about workship, right? So that work becomes workship at the same time. But also another article where we discussed self-transcendence, which links to previous talk today about servant leadership, that effectively religion is not only transforming what entrepreneurship means, but also the ultimate purpose of entrepreneurship. And in the article that I'm also sharing again, we kind of mentioned 4 types of kind of self-transcendent aspects. It could be other people, it can be social collectives, it can be moral principles and ideals, and it can also be metaphysical beings, so a deity, a god, right? And so at the very individual level, religion shapes, as I said, forms and transforms what it means to be an entrepreneur. At the meso level, and again, a couple of articles here that I share, is it shapes obviously how organizings are working. And again, the organizings can be religious themselves, right? It can be an Islamic bank, as in this case, it can be a church, etc. It can be a religious organization, it can be a non-religious organization with religious connotations, but any kind of secular organization also has to think about religion. And I mean, I was approached a couple of years ago by a company asking me about religion as a kind of demographic factor, right? Which is true again, and here's the link to this. But it's much more than that, right? So we have to understand how religion matters. So even if the person himself or herself, the leader, the manager, the entrepreneur is not religious, people around them are, so it matters to understand what this means. And then so as I move quickly from the micro to the meso, now to the macro level, religion also matters at the macro level. And again, here, a quick sharing of an article here where I discuss that if one uses the institutional logics, right, religion it's an institutional logic. It has intra-religious logic plurality, right? We have different religions, and that matters. But also, and that I think is quite interesting for some people, for many people, it actually has prevalence. So it's not just one logic amongst many. It actually matters more for many. And I think, again, today we've heard some people saying that their whole academic career was shaped by their faith, which means effectively that faith was prevalent on their academic practice and so on. So it shows how important that is. And in a way, I would say that religion is, if we think about these different levels, micro, meso, and macro, religion actually is, and I'm arguing this in this piece here, is the very macro. So religion goes even beyond, right? The transcendent is effectively beyond the macro that we know. So to kind of close this in the next 3 whole minutes about the political, what does this mean? The world is complex, right? We know this notion of UCAP, right? The world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and paradoxical. And religion is part of it. Religion might be an answer to it. Religion also shapes that complexity. And I think that is beautiful. And what we've done, I think, as scholars outside maybe this community, is we've simplified too much sometimes the world. We've disregarded religion because we thought that if academia has to be secular, again, question mark, then also the field we are studying has to be secular. But if the world and religion is a social fact, we have to study that social fact, and we have to mirror, explain, and theorize that reality. So we have to embrace the complexity. And in brackets, I think if we look at the world today in politics, and almost no talk should can pass without mentioning, you know who, right? Lord Voldemort in the world right now. Then these politicians who are populist effectively try to simplify reality, and I think we have to embrace the complexity that includes faith. A second point, I think, is that that imagination, like we're in an imagination crisis, and that's like work on these other futures that I've done, where I've engaged with this challenge that effectively empirics, but also scholars, I think we have to do much more on the imagination front, right? So we have to, as practitioners, we need that, and we see that actually past futures seem to be better than present futures, and that's a challenge for democracy. And as scholars, I think that means that we also have to co-create that future. So we have to co-create, imagine data, and work on that. And that means effectively that values become important, right? And religion is, again, one source of these values. So somehow religion can be a source for imagination. It's certainly a source for values. And the question is, how do we integrate that into our scholarship? And then the third point is maybe on commitment, and that was also part of your question, right, on context, but also on commitment. Religion matters there as well. And again, here, a piece that we published, I think, 2 years ago, where religion shapes the commitment to things. And if I think about, for instance, Islamic finance and so on, many people, many scholars also misread the role of religion, actually. Even the notion of Sharia compliance in Islamic finance, right, is I think, a wrong notion, because compliance means you are adhering to that rule to the extent necessary. But what I think what we've heard today, and what I've seen also when I interview people, so it's not my view, but it's the view that effectively of empirical reality, that people are not compliant to faith, but they're committed to faith. And when I give executive education talks on this, I ask people how long it takes them to pray, right? So go to church on Sunday, and then they say, like, I don't know, half an hour, they pray the Zuhr prayer, the lunch prayer, the noon prayer, and say like 8 minutes or something. And then I say to them, be as efficient as possible. How quick can you pray? And then they say in the church, like 15 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, right? And I'm saying, is that the purpose of that prayer, right? And then people say, no, the purpose of the prayer is not to be as efficient as possible, which means effectively that we're moving away from faith as compliance to faith as commitment. And again, I think empirically we see that, and we have to develop the language for that. And in Islamic finance, I think the language of compliance is exactly, sorry, it's the train passing through. The language of compliance is then actually misleading. And so we scholars mislead practitioners through that language. And then my last point really is that faith, and I think with all the praise that we have to give to faith, I think is a double-edged sword, and we have to be realistic, right? So like the digital, it's an affordance for the worst and the best in humans. And that's the empirical reality of faith. Science on it is 100% helpful, right? So whereas faith, I think, is a double-edged sword, I'd say the science on faith and entrepreneurship is not, right? We need more of it. I think with that, I close, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you standing by for the discussion. Also, I want to say go inside and get warm. Just masterful. Thank you. Laurenz, I will turn to you. In your meta-analysis paper, you call for greater theoretical specification while conducting research on faith and entrepreneurship. How'd you arrive at that need? Where does that come from?
Harry, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. Excited to be part of the panel and the conference. And of course, it's great to see everybody, and also thanks to the previous panelists. I think a lot what has already been said actually connects very closely to what I want to highlight from our paper, Religion and Entrepreneurship, Meta-analysis, which is a joint work by Eric Lehmann and myself. And before I'm going to address your question, Corey, please allow me to briefly locate the paper first, especially for those who may not even know it yet or still deciding should I read it or should I not read it. And the paper asks basically a very basic general question. What is the effect? What do we actually know about the relationship between religion and entrepreneurship? And I think the question is more difficult than it sounds, because on the one hand, we know it from so many different research streams, religion is obviously important and it has a matter for economic life. But on the other hand, the empirical literature in entrepreneurship has produced very mixed findings. Some studies find positive effects, some negative effects, some find no effect at all. And especially, how do we measure religion? Sometimes I see it as a belief, as a practice, as an affiliation, be a church member or not be a church member. Others use it as an institutional context. So the field had become quite large, but at the same time also quite fragmented. And I think this is a good starting point to think about doing a meta-analysis, because sometimes I have the feeling we are in the middle of a jungle and we're still looking for the right direction where to move on. And I think closely connected is an empirical issue, I would say, that empirical analysis tend to flatten the phenomenon, because if you measure religion because based on if you are a member of the church or not, then it's hard to argue, hey, what is the moral vocabulary, the source of trust, or how do we deal with uncertainty, adversity, or religious identity? And it hurts because I love doing empirical work at the same time, but sometimes I have the feeling we miss how religion becomes silent and religion. So, and our Maintenance, we used a couple of studies, converted them into effect sizes, and it should come with no surprise. We find a very small positive effect. And I would say, okay, now what? So basically, it's a very descriptive finding. The more important result, in my opinion, is the high heterogeneity, especially the heterogeneity within the subgroups we have created. So what about the context? What about different religions? What about different entrepreneurial outcomes? What about culture, institutional context, and so on? So I would say this is the theoretical productive finding of our paper, because the small average effect tells us, oh, okay, there's something about the overall relationship. But the heterogeneity tells us what kind of phenomenon religion actually is, because it suggests religion should not be treated as a stable, independent variable or like a fixed effect. Quite the opposite. Because if we want to move the field further, we need to ask ourselves, how can we improve it? How can we talk about identity, about logic? How can we use these mechanisms to actually understand the effects of religion and how it actually might work? So, another finding which is quite interesting is that religion does not perform uniformly. Sometimes we see contexts where it has a complement power, where culture is reinforcing existing norms such as hierarchy, for example, or authority. In those cases, religion strengthens patterns that are already culturally or institutionally present. In other contexts, it acts more like a substitute, especially by shaping uncertainty perceptions, for example, or entrepreneurial actions where the frameworks, where the environment maybe are weaker or less stable. In those settings, religion may provide orientation, confidence. But this is something where we need to be cautious and we need to look further into the detail. So the key takeaway from the paper, from the slide, is small average effect does not imply weak relevance for the field, but it implies that a religion is context-dependent and theoretical underspecified in much of the current or the past empirical literature. So, what can we learn from that? Let's move further to the implications. So, first of all, if the same religious category does not generate the same entrepreneurial outcome across different contexts, then religion should be theorized as a context-dependent source of identities, logics, and mechanisms, for example. So, and one important reason for this contextual variation, let's put it this way, is in my view legitimacy. First of all, legitimacy of religion as a topic in entrepreneurship research itself. Religion has often remained somewhat at the margins of the field. When I started my PhD and I was like, I want to conduct research on religion entrepreneurship, it was like too normative, too cultural, too private, too difficult to measure. So part of the challenge that we have also to face is disciplinary. It's about treating religion as an disciplinary power than something that it's at the margins. And the second sense of legitimacy is the legitimacy of religion within the entrepreneurial life itself, because I think this is where the argument becomes especially important. Faith-based identities are not equally legitimate across contexts. In some settings, religion can be a resource. It can provide meaning, belonging, moral confidence, and resilience. But in other settings, it may be a source of stigma, contestation, or delegitimization. So it can also complicate legitimacy in this regard. So that's why I think legitimacy helps explain part of the contextual variation we observe in the meta-analysis. And that might point to that we call under-theorized contextual complexity, I would say. So what can we learn for future research for that? Religion is not simple something that is, I have religion. I have religion in my data set, and that's why I have the possibility to say there's an effect. I did it myself a couple of times, and actually I don't like it anymore when someone is saying religion has an effect on, it's way too general. We need to be more precise, because we need to ask, we need not to ask, does it matter? We need to ask, in what kind of context becomes silent? Is it because, does it appear as identity, as a logic, as practice, as a narrative, or legitimacy work? Or is it because of the stigma management? So I think this is the lesson learned. What I wanted to convey with the study, that we need to be careful about the context, and only if we trying to create like a context-based theory, I think we can move forward and to increase legitimacy in the field. And I think looking at the past fabulous presentations today, I think we are definitely moving into the right directions, and hopefully I will be able to do a meta-analysis again in a couple of years and saying, hey, it's improved, and we can say we have something good to tell about the research field religion entrepreneurship. So Corey, yes, we have some kind, we have the state of the art right now, but I'm promiseful for the future. Perfect.
Wonderful. Laurenz, I'm so grateful for your challenge. I think I have a wonderful response for you from Gunjan, who is going to speak about her work. If I can ask a question. So speaking about the need for contextualization, what does a heavily contextualized formation of entrepreneurial identities through practice of spiritual symbolism and embodied gendered performance look like? And I think we have some examples here. Gunjan, welcome. You are on mute.
Sorry about that.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Tara, for inviting me and for giving me an opportunity to present my ongoing work in Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So today's focus is on subaltern women in all these different countries. So two of the papers already published. So the one on Vietnamese women was recently published in Gender Work in Organization, and you can read about women in floating markets in Thailand in Journal of Sustainable Tourism. And I'm about to submit another paper on Cambodian and Thailand context in research policy next month. So hopefully you'll read a little bit more. So just to give you a context, after SPIVX, this is how we understand subaltern communities. So historically colonized people, systematically silenced, dominated, and also other marginalized and disempowered groups. Because mind you, Thailand was never colonized. But again, some of these women, they exist on the periphery in the floating markets. They're invisible women, so they do not exist in official databases. So most of these women are included in my research in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. They do not exist in official databases. So policymakers, they don't know and they don't care basically, just because they operate in informal economies. So what I found through my work was that as a result of lack of policy support, women have found a discourse of intimacy with each other in the sense that they look after each other. There is gradual diminishing influence of men in their lives. So men have either been pushed out of the marketplace or they're looking after domestic roles to support their women, daughters, and partners. And although the society in Southeast Asia, it remains predominantly patriarchal, a key lesson emerging from my work is that hegemony of men is no longer absolute. So there's change in power dynamics as we speak. But then you cannot claim these subaltern women to be embracing post-feminist identity as we understand in the West. So they're engaging in double dealing by displaying gender-conforming behaviors when it suits them and exercising more communal discourses or empowered discourses in their social lives. This ties in with Butler's notion of fluidity, whereby gender is detached from sex and it becomes a flexible construct. So the research question within this context, and that underpins my study in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, was that how do these women, they're using physical spaces to attract and engage visitors on one hand, and then using their spirituality in contesting their subaltern identities while navigating their roles as entrepreneurs. And by the way, the picture that you see on the right is one of the temple complexes in Cambodia, extremely beautiful. So if you haven't been to Cambodia, it's a US dollar dependent economy and highly recommended before you die. It's extremely, extremely beautiful. So within that context, there's respect for hierarchy, tradition, and community. And Cambodian government is consciously supporting women-led enterprises, so especially around the temple economy. So they've taken a lead. Here you can see on the left a picture of a tour guide. And again, they are strategically positioned to create a sense of well-being and reassurance amongst travelers because Cambodia has had a history of violence. And I'll give you an example of how women are mobilizing the historical and lived experiences of violence and reworking these into difficult histories into narratives, into aesthetics, into embodied practices that not only capture your attention as visitors, but communicate layered meanings. So for instance, when I was buying tickets to temple complexes, my attention was drawn to these beautiful trinkets and jewelry, and they were not too high in value. So I was intrigued by what kind of metal that they were made. And the answer is right there before you in front of your eyes in this picture. So they're made out of recycled bullets. And this is the only place where women are sort of translating the experience of violence, not only in terms of symbolism, but into concrete commodities. So they've modified their living with actual violence. So they were happy to share narratives of how their grandfathers or fathers, they were taken away by Khmer Rouge. So it's an interesting narrative, which I need to explore further because of language barriers as well. My research was limited, so I need to revisit Cambodia again to find out a little bit more about the supply chain and where this symbolism is coming from. So taking into account post-colonial history, my second case study focuses on Mekong women entrepreneurs, and you can read this work in Gender Work in Organization. So I was pleasantly surprised to come across these empowered women, smart business women, because they operate in the Mekong Delta. They do not exist, as I said before, in official databases, but yet they are landowners. Some of them, they've married into landed gentry, so they've acquired land ownership, and they're sort of transforming this newfound power into entrepreneurial intelligence, in the sense that they are sort of selling lemon teas and herbal teas and even processed goods which are sourced from their farms. So the lady on the right that you see, she was fluent in English despite having no formal education, and she's picked up the language through her interface with visitors. Also, I found that fruits and vegetables, they've got a spiritual identity and meaning for these women. So I came across a number of coconut candy factories, low scale, not factory in the context of how we understand factories in the Western civilization, but very low scale enterprises, mostly people by women, and they work extremely long hours. So from 7 a.m. in the morning till 9 p.m. with no break, even on Sunday. But then they consider each other as part of a family. And then the very fact that they're together in this enterprise of making their life better, this exploitative system where they're sort of, taking care of the enterprise and the running of it at the expense of the social life, that becomes secondary. And this is what I found in the case of singing women on the Unicorn Island. So again, unwittingly, I was part and parcel of this exploitative capitalist system. So as part of me buying an all-inclusive ticket, I walked into this premise and then women started singing, and I was expected to pay tips to them. And that was not my plan, but I was just watching them. So they would sort of mix Vietnamese folk songs with Western melodies, like if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Well, I didn't think that happiness translated into their eyes. So they're part of a commodified system, as we understand. So these are different dimensions of women's identity work, which I uncovered in Vietnam. So there's definite influence of social norms. Some of them, they alluded to the presence of plainclothes policemen and women on the island, but they did not elaborate further on what was being policed, what was being observed. Then there's overlap between family and business identities. So I noticed that when one woman was looking after her suppliers, or she had to take a day out, other women gladly, they chipped in. So, and they handed over the profit at the end of the day. So there's mutual reliance on each other. There's predominance of personal role and social identities, in that sense that each of the day, it begins with a small prayer to the Mekong River, which is reified as a goddess. And that sort of drives the tourism economy in this island. And also, whilst they're embracing post-feminist identities, there's conformity with societal expectation. So that's from the identity work perspective. But from an entrepreneurial marketing perspective, so we understand it in the mainstream marketing literature, but then women are displaying similar attributes. So for instance, creating authenticity through storytelling. So they would gladly tell you how as children they learn tapestry or craft making from their mothers, grandmothers, and they're translating that value into commodified goods for the sake of visitors. Then similarly, proactiveness. So they're using extra land or extra room in the houses even to open it for homestays visitors. I mean, one of the participants, she said that behind every curtain, in every nook and corner, you'll find somebody making something on this island. So it's an enterprising economy here. And that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, it translates into Thailand's floating markets as well. So this paper you can read in Journal of Sustainable Tourism. But then their spirituality, their faith, it plays a central role in these women's lives. So On the left, you can see this lady, she's sort of preparing candles, which visitors offer at the temples. So in all floating markets, I observed there was a Buddhist shrine. And they carried on with their daily routine. So this lady on the right, I mean, she carried on peeling mangoes even while we were interviewing her, because time is of immense value to them. They're extremely busy. But then there was this COVID period, which sort of enhanced their precarity. So this lady, Busabo, she says that I had to learn to catch fish, something I'd not done since I was a child, just to eat, just to survive. And the same narrative, it translates into other women's accounts as well. But here you come across this enterprising grandmother, a 70-year-old woman who you think would be retiring, but on the contrary, I mean, she's become some kind of a celebrity and people stop to take pictures with her. She's got her menu, which you can download on your mobile using a QR code. And that was a surprise. We weren't expecting that to happen in the floating market. And again, she's using the age-old recipes to create an exciting menus. And her business motto was, as a translator did it for us, is cook fast, serve fast, and deal with customers in a lightning fashion. So again, it's an enterprising grandmother. And here you've got Nanook, who was selling trinkets in Damnon Sadok floating market. And she reflected on how her performance, it came to a standstill during COVID time. But despite this difficulty, I mean, she's putting a happy end and again, self-reliance as well that comes across in a narrative. I mean, she said that advantage of working here is that you don't have to go to a foreign country. So she feels a sense of pride despite everything else going on in her life. And as I said earlier, I mean, Anong, she's become kind of a poster girl for floating market canoe women entrepreneurs. So people take pictures, she doesn't mind. Some of them, they tip her. And again, even though she feels that there's intrusion and there's tourist case, but then she's happy to oblige, as it were. And then what I noticed was that they're enacting post-feminist agency. So floating markets are liminal spaces where women are disembedded from their traditional roles. And they're embracing an empowered identity where you cannot say that they're fully empowered in the sense that they're still reliant on men or the system, as it were, which is, again, does not care about them. There are no benefits that are sort of in place to support these women. When COVID help was being given out by the government, it was always targeting men or larger enterprises. So again, they do not benefit a great deal more. But then within that context, they derive their resilience from their faith. So in each floating market, there's a Buddhist shrine. So this, you can see my co-author from China. And as cultural insiders, we could understand of how they've created a sacred imagined community in these floating markets. And the same principle of sacred landscape, it translates into the second case study I did in central Thailand. So we focus on Ayutthaya and Saraburi. So for those of you from India, Ayutthaya is a variant of Ayodhya. So there's influence of Hinduism in these provinces. This is the profile of participants. So it's a mix of male and female being included, a number of young farmers, as well as those more established. And what we were intrigued by was this rice beckoning ceremony, and especially given that Thailand is still a patriarchal society, whereas a female of leader, it can be a farmer's wife or farmer herself, she takes the lead in terms of worshipping Mai Foso, and who's the rice goddess. So rice is sort of feminized, and again, worship. So here you'll see a wicker basket, a boiled egg, chicken as well in some cases, freshly made rice bowls. So every object here has got spiritual significance for these communities, tamarind and salt to ward off evil. And also, since she's worshipping a lady, there's this element of ornamentation as well. So mirror, comb, powder, scented water, twigs, sarong, anything to appease the goddess. But then, and this is what it looks like, the rice picking ceremony for these Thai farmers. But then, as technology is embraced by rice farming communities, this sort of ceremonial aspect is fast disappearing. And women, they tend to work on the margins. They're never taken into account when policies are drafted or initiatives are planned. So there's a smart farmers initiative in Thailand, but women are not part of it because they're not considered to be serious enough. And also because you're able to plant rice 4 times in a year as opposed to once. So that kind of ceremonial blessing seeking, that's disappeared as well. Incomers have moved in as farmers are fast selling their land or diversifying into tourism because these two communities, they're in close proximity to Bangkok. So it's changing the landscape here. Also, these are some of the comments. So farmers are in debt due to the burden of increasing farming costs. So there was lack of subsidies, one of the farmers reported. They also reported problems with the middlemen. Peasants who depend on the middlemen, they put themselves at a disadvantage, others reported, and government does nothing to control prices. So there was a lot of anger against agency and lack of formal support. And again, you can see of how this rice farming landscape is conceptualized as a sacred space. So farming is constructed as a sacred landscape, and you can see nobody is wearing a footwear. And as a partial cultural insider, I could find some kind of resonance because in some Indian homes, you leave your footwear outside to keep the sanctity, the purity of the place. So in all these case studies, what comes across as the resilience of these women, their faith, and also within the context of post-colonial society, there's negotiated acts of resistance and accommodation within restrictive social cultures. So women's entrepreneurial activities, for example, they reflect both continuities with traditional roles, but also which are tied to family and community, by the way, but then they're also experiencing or enacting transformation, which is spurred by market liberalization and globalization, and also shaped by their history of post-colonialism as they're embracing market economies and new identities, economic activities, they're deeply embedded in both traditional gender norms and evolving market dynamics in all these societies. So as they're fast modernizing and embracing modern values, they're also being tied by patriarchy and traditional gender norms that restricts women's agency. But then having said that, I mean, they're making a difference. They're trying to sort of, some of them, they were divorced, they were single. And I was pleasantly surprised that they could support themselves and their family members. I mean, one of the younger women I interviewed, she wanted to be like me, to be able to travel elsewhere. So there's aspirational roles that are available to these women as a result of globalization. Many of them are engaging digital economy. So despite their limited educational skills, they've set up their websites and they're using ChatGPT equivalent to create narratives around their products. So that was quite enlightening for me. So on that note, I would close. And any questions?
Just fascinating. I love the approach bringing gender and religious practice into thinking about formation of entrepreneurial identity. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think we'll go directly to David and then at the end see if we have time for questions. David, thank you for being with us. I have a question to start us off, but then I'm delighted to see where you will go. How does faith community involvement shape the psychology of poverty-based entrepreneurs?
Yeah, what a provocatively interesting question. And again, grateful to be here and grateful to see so many familiar faces, friends, and to meet some new folks as well and hear some great presentations. So I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to tackle Corey's question tied into a couple of studies that we've done. And then I'm going to kind of shift into what I think is an interesting provocation that we're exploring through a variety of different perspectives. And so again, my research kind of cuts across multiple themes, and certainly thinking a lot recently about the impact of artificial intelligence on entrepreneurship. And so I'm going to kind of blend some of those pieces together to address this really interesting question, right? So to what extent does poverty impact the psychology of entrepreneurship? And specifically then, what complications or challenges does AI present to that? So within that, we published a paper, a book chapter last year, and this is with Rob Pittick and Lowell. And so you'll see a little bit of Rob and Lowell. So I've listed them on this presentation, not because they necessarily would agree with everything that I'm going to present, but more just because some of their perspectives are woven into this. And this particular book chapter tackled that question head on, and it sort of was thinking about the role of religious belief and religious community almost as what we'd call like an epistemic infrastructure, right? So you sort of think about the impact, negative impact, oftentimes people theorize that poverty has. We were looking at the community formation and role of religious belief and how that might support or even mitigate some of those particular challenges. And so we looked through a couple different perspectives, different angles here. And so I won't, necessarily develop each one of these in depth, as much as to say that part of it, poverty, one of the big impacts we know is that it sort of, creates very significant structural relational constraints on entrepreneurs, right? Low social status. Then we talked about kind of the alternatives that religious community, right? Because it provides a different way of ordering and different types of relational ties. We talked a lot about cultivating cognitive tools of how the ability to lead and potentially contribute within a local religious community, provides an interesting type of training ground, even for entrepreneurial skills like public speaking, pitching, things along those lines. And then we kind of tackled a theme, I think that's very near and dear specifically to Lowell's heart, and this idea of enabling venture flourishing. And on this particular point, right, we sort of thought about just the impact that religious belief, religious community provides, and think about flourishing again as an alternative set of metrics here, and defining it really as in kind of the state, right, where the organizational goals, community goals, founders' vocational, personal goals are collectively realized such that an organization reaches a point where it can constructively sustain itself for this foreseeable future. Right. So within that kind of definitional space, right, we kind of theorize and try to understand, the positive impacts, right? Where does religion and religious belief, religious community augment and shape what people are experiencing, right? And the support mechanisms, right? The encouragement. One of my favorite papers that's been published the last couple of years, Brett's paper with his colleagues on relational identity and God, right? This idea that even anchoring someone who's struggling, right, and dealing with the psychological fallout of maybe facing potential bankruptcy of a company or significant challenges that are happening in process, how even someone's relationship with the deity, with God, can stabilize and provide encouragement beyond what people or other things can provide. So within that, right, we think about kind of this multiplicative benefit and multiplicative function. And so the interesting thing to sort of think through this now and sort of reflect on changes that are happening more broadly in society, and this is sort of where the provocation comes in. And again, I'm going to move through some of this quite quickly, just to maybe save a little bit of time, hopefully at the end for questions. There's a wonderful book that was published a couple of years ago called The Ordinal Society, right? And these are two great social theorists. If you are on social media, Kieran Healy used to be very publicly prominent. One of my favorite people to follow. He was always so hilarious. But just a really deep thinker around the impact of technology, the impact of the algorithmic age on how society itself is structured and ordered. And so there's this problem of what is emerging around this theme of epistemic stratification, right? And so within that, right, the instance of AI being incorporated into lots of digital platforms and providing kind of mediating mechanisms to shape how we interact with each other. across so many different dimensions of our daily lives and work, right? They talked about the impact in terms of like the mechanisms of how that ordering is happening, right? And so then this automated ranking and matching process that creates this sense of inevitability, but even more the sort of normative rightness, so to speak, of those hierarchies that are created, right? So you can see here a little bit of the provocation in the sense that religious community can offset typical social stratification problems that emerged in sort of pre-digital society. But now we have kind of the reemergence of that reordering or reemergence of these algorithmically defined stratification problems. What happens in the middle of that, right? What problems are presented, and then to what extent, are these new challenges something that religious communities can then work through or help offset, right? So there's things like algorithmic status reinforcement, the stratification problem itself, right? Looks at kind of the differential access to tools, and there's some really interesting examples I'll highlight here in just a second. But I think the stakes are quite high. And I think the impact of AI in terms of how it's reshaping work, how it's reshaping commerce and society is something worth, as entrepreneurship scholars, to reflect on, of how it would impact things like platform-dependent entrepreneurship, right? Because one of the things that we know, and we highlighted a little bit, it wasn't the primary purpose of our recent annals paper, we called digital battlegrounds, but we looked at kind of what's happening on digital platforms. And we talked about like digital serfdom, as one instance or an outcome of this, of people, entrepreneurs who are dependent on these platforms for their livelihood. And so this could be sort of gig workers, right, who then, all of their workflow and all of their livelihood is shaped by platform ratings and how quickly they're able to respond to needs, and how much the person they drove from point A to point B enjoyed the trip, and all sorts of the opacity around how algorithms are managing and mediating that process. And there's a lot of really nice research highlighting, I think, the problems or the challenges that being managed by the algorithm is creating. Credit scoring, algorithmic lending. There's a great example in China of the Ant Group that had some things built into these AI-powered algorithms that were defining lending decisions that really weren't taking into account the role of poverty. They were looking at metrics that arise out of machine learning to say this is predictive of whether or not someone's going to pay back the loan, but had nothing to do with the person's character or livelihood. It had very much to do with the type of work that they were doing. But I think within this, it kind of creates this ordinal paradox, right? And so I think, they show in the book, they talk about, again, this provocative idea that, the algorithmic poverty trap creates this hollow morality, right? And so you see kind of the reemergence of all of these, stratified outcomes for people that are kind of framed as this illusion of merit, right? That you are experiencing these things. Your success as a platform-dependent entrepreneur is driven by your work ethic and your engagement and affect or whatever it is, and not necessarily really accounting for the way that the platforms and the way that these algorithms themselves are shaping it. And so within this, right, these platforms provide a very powerful mechanism for the Matthew effect, right, of the rich getting richer. And so potentially, rather than democratizing or disintermediating things, they're actually creating very intense mediation pressures and, maximizing kind of this rich gets richer dynamic. And so potentially accelerating a poverty trap. And so the provocation is, right, to what extent can faith communities offset some of these particular challenges? And I think within that, right, we highlight a few pieces of this, right? Status sanctuaries, non-rankable capacities, potentially this idea of epistemic commons. And I know we're getting to the end, so I won't take the time to kind of work through that. But the question fundamentally is, right, if the ordinal society encodes poverty again as a sort of new rationalized hierarchy, what does it mean to build institutions and platform-dependent entrepreneurship that can resist or at least challenge some of that classification? And so I'm not going to take the time to read this, but just to say, one of my, my wife always finds this humorous. I've been working on things for a year, in this particular one, but I have it called the cyborg neo-futuristic translation of different ancient religious texts to kind of think through this. And this is one from the Tao Te Ching. And I think, in the end, it kind of talks about this idea of, when users dwell in not knowing and not wanting, even the clever algorithms hesitate to manipulate. And so for me, again, that intersection of the future in ancient past, ancient wisdom, shaping how we think about the future era. This idea of using and understanding, religion in a way that helps us still pursue flourishing, even under a different set of constraints, I think represents a very fundamentally important project. And so, then I'll just say, poverty is not reduced by fixing the individual, right, but by enabling the context. And so in that sense, how do we build better platforms, better systems, and better modes of entrepreneurship to address some of these challenges? So I'll stop there. I think we're right at the end of our session. So maybe a couple minutes for questions, but thank you very much.
Wonderful. Just outstanding. In a panel on contextualized knowledge around faith and entrepreneurship, 4 different visions, I think all moving in the same direction, that we're called to understand the specificity and complexity of the world that we are trying to understand. So I thank all of you. That was wonderful.